Right, welcome everyone to the second of our Land and Nature webinar series during Churches Count on Nature. I suspect if you're here, you probably all know that Churches Count on Nature is going on at the moment. We've got well over 300 churches around the country who are getting together with their community in their churchyards and looking to see what species and plants and birds they find there. And during Churches Count on Nature, here centrally at the Church of England, we're running a whole series of webinars on land and nature, of which one today is all about Forest Church. That was meant to click on. Let's try that again. There we go. If you haven't been to one of these webinars before, I'm Catherine Ross. I am in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division at the Church of England. I lead on environmental matters for them, and I'm part of the team that runs the environment programme. And our two speakers today are very, very experienced in Forest Church. We've got Cate Williams, the Environmental Engagement Officer for Gloucester Diocese, Forest Church facilitator and the author of the main Grove booklet all about this topic. And Rachel Summers, the author of Resources, a Forest School practitioner, a Forest Church facilitator, and a pioneer ordinand. So lots of really practical experience to be able to tell you what Forest Church is and how it works. Before they get going, I just want to give you a taster of the other webinars that we've got coming up. It's a really packed week. So we're just up here on the second of a whole series of 12 webinars. Please do come along. If you haven't already booked onto the other topics, have a look. There's so much going on this week. And I'd just like to thank all of the speakers who are doing the webinars this week. They're all volunteering their time. The majority of the speakers are drawn from our amazing Diocesan Environment Officer network from all around the country. And on Saturday, Sheffield Diocese is having an online eco-church festival linked to Churches Count on Nature. I'll put a link into this webinar programme and to the Sheffield event when I've finished speaking. And then looking a little bit further ahead, the other webinars we've got booked at the moment, we've got one on heat pumps coming up in the 13th of July. We've got a series on eco-church, and then we've got our 2 webinars on environmental fundraising coming up in September. And again, I'll put the link to those in the chat when I've finished speaking. In terms of housekeeping today, we'll be using the Q&A rather than the chat for questions. So if you can move your mouse around and find the Q&A, that's where you want to pop your questions, and you'll be able to see other people's questions there and put a little thumbs up next to the questions you're most interested in. Those ones will go to the top, and those are the ones we'll spend time on when Rachel and Cate have finished speaking. And after the webinar is finished today, I'll email everybody here today with the slides, with any links from the chat, and with a link through to our feedback form so that hopefully you can tell us whether we did a good job today. I think that is everything in terms of the introductions. So it's over to you, Cate, to lead us off.
Slides up. Oh. And of course, my mouse is being sticky. Okay. Just a few seconds. We'll get there in a minute. I'm just waiting until I can go into my slideshow. Here we go. Okay.
Perfect.
So, we have already been introduced, so I will skip that and jump straight in. What I do want to say is that this seminar feels a little like the odd one out in the series, in the sense that all of the rest are directly about nature. And this one is more about the human encounter with nature. An odd one out, but actually a right foot in a really important part of the jigsaw puzzle, because this is really about us resetting our attitudes and our relationship with nature, and doing so prayerfully. And then all kinds of other stuff follows in terms of our relationship with the natural world and how we live with respect to the natural world as we appreciate and as we grow in love for God's creation, and then action for nature's well-being follows on from that. It also has an added bonus in that worshipping outdoors can allow us to engage with people who might never join us indoors. So we might find people joining our Forest Church community that we are unlikely to find in a Sunday morning congregation. So there's that as well for Forest churches. So I'm going to focus on the what and the why of Forest Church, and then I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who is going to bring her Forest School experience into the equation. So I'm starting with the backstory, and you'll see that I've got a news thing up there. There's been a lot of interest in Forest Church over the last year or so, and I think, you know, being outdoors has been safer than being indoors for a large chunk of the last year. And a lot of churches are beginning to explore worship outdoors, particularly for children and families work, as part of their risk assessed worship under the current circumstances. But I want to highlight the fact that that's not the only reason that we are doing this. It's been a particular prompt over the past year, but the story of Forest Church is longer. And in fact, the story of Forest Church is a short one with a longer backstory, a significantly longer backstory. So I've put an image up there of Bruce Stanley's book, Forest Church, which was published in 2013. And that is, it's a real beginning and a launch of the current Forest Church movement, which is an expression within Fresh Expressions, within Pioneer Ministry of worship outdoors. So 2013 is probably the beginning of the contemporary conversation, but the backstory as well. So here we go with the backstory. So I've put up a bit of Franciscan spirituality, just to remind us that this isn't a new thing since 2013. This is more a rediscovery of something that has been lost and forgotten within the Christian tradition. That's kind of fresh within Fresh Expressions, within Pioneer Ministry. We're re-engaging in a way that has been part of Christianity for centuries, but perhaps has been a bit on the back burner more recently. So this new Forest Church movement is a rediscovery rather than anything which is actually new in itself. So this long tradition is one which prays outside, one which finds God in nature, one which has a depth of connection to the natural world. So the baseline of Forest Church is doing outdoors what you couldn't do indoors, doing outdoors something which has engagement with nature, what often gets called nature connection, as the core of the worship. There are all kinds of other kinds of worship that can happen outdoors. Good Friday, witness celebrations, or Palm Sunday, or just going outdoors in summer with your guitars and some singing, which is fabulous and absolutely has its place within Christian worship. But it's a different thing from Forest Church, because Forest Church always has engagement with nature as core to what is happening. And I've put up an illustration there from one of my Forest Church gatherings, which is an autumn walk in the beechwood, and we were looking at the colours of the beech leaves. So you can see the I want to say rainbow, but you can't say rainbow when it's green and yellow and brown, but that kind of spectrum of colours in the leaves. So it's that kind of engagement with nature which is always core to Forest Church. So this is also part of the backstory. The environmental movement has, over recent years, discovered in terms of the psychology of engaging people, we can't always be negative. We can't always be telling people that you're doing stuff wrong and you need to sort yourself out, and guilt tripping people into better environmental choices. Because what happens when we try that is that people put their barriers up, because it's too much and it feels too difficult, and so we all kind of put our barriers up and hide, and then end up doing nothing, and nothing changes, even if we kind of know in our head that we ought to. Somehow it's difficult to get that forward movement. So a lot of the environmental charities recently have been encouraging nature connection. They've been encouraging us to fall in love with the natural world, because once we fall in love with the natural world, then we are more likely to do the difficult things that are necessary in order to live differently with respect to nature. So I've put up a few examples here. For a school, I will leave to Rachel. She's much better equipped to speak on that one. But the National Trust's 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4. Lots of very ordinary things like catching a falling leaf, climbing a tree, damming a stream, generally things that involve getting muddy and outdoors and just playing in nature. Wildlife Watch, this is a really good resource website from the National Wildlife Trusts, all kinds of stuff, again, which engage children and families. And I could have put up all sorts of other examples from the Woodland Trust, from the RSPB, from all the different environmental charities are trying to encourage us to engage with the natural world, to notice, to appreciate, to fall in love, and from there come changed attitudes and changed lifestyle choices. I've also got Richard Louve's book, Last Child in the Woods, which is a fabulous read. He uses the term nature deficit disorder and talks about how little children engage with the natural world compared to, let's say, 50 years ago. And actually, if we're going back 50 years, a lot of today's adults are those who have suffered from nature deficit disorder as children. So they've grown up not really understanding how to engage with nature. And that has knock-on effects in terms of all sorts of bad habits, just littering, to go with a really ordinary one, but just not understanding that it's important and not understanding why it's important. But there's also things about our well-being and the fact that it feels like we are that we are created to have a relationship with the natural world, and when we're not, our well-being suffers. All kinds of research out there in terms of things like recovery in hospital. If you can see green out of the hospital windows, recovery is measurably quicker than if you can't. And there's scientific studies statistically proven on that kind of thing. So Richard Louve, he writes for a broad audience. He's not this isn't a Christian book as such, but he's writing for a broad audience, but he is himself writing as a Christian, and there's a chapter towards the end where he talks more explicitly about spiritual development and about Christianity. So this is a quote from his about how adults describe with eloquence and awe the role of nature in their early spiritual development, and how that connection continued to deepen as they aged. He also talks about how little churches nurture and encourage this, which is, of course, where Forest Church comes in, because that's what we are all about. This was doing the rounds on Facebook. I've just picked this one up as a Facebook meme, but again, this is where the church comes in terms of the environmental crisis. I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. To deal with these, we need cultural and spiritual transformation. So perhaps the church has something to do and to say in here. Okay, a little bit of theology, not too heavy, I hope, but really important, because I want to be clear that Forest Church in in exploring nature connection as worship isn't just jumping onto a bandwagon of something that is popular around us at the moment. But what seems to be happening is the spirit at work in wider society that is alerting us to something that has been lost and forgotten within our faith and our tradition, which we are now rediscovering. So Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament theologian, and in the way of Old Testament theologians doing all of the detailed work and looking at what it says in the original Hebrew and all of this kind of stuff, I'm ignoring all of that. I'm trusting him on the work that he's done and just going with the headline that he comes up with of this three-way relationship between Yahweh, between God and the people and the land. And by land, we're not talking here about land as in political boundaries, but something much more earthy, the soil, everything that grows in it, everything that is sustained within the soil, everything that lives off the soil in the sense of eating what has grown. So there's this three-way connection between God and the people and the land. And in church, we tend to talk particularly about the left-hand side of this triangle, which is the relationship, the living relationship between God and individual human beings and the community of human beings. So that's the left-hand side of the triangle. The bottom, I guess, is nature connection. That's the relationship between people and all the rest that God has made. And then on the right-hand side, the sense that God has an ongoing relationship with all that God has made. That it's not that God set creation going and then stood back and let it go, but God continues to have an ongoing and living relationship with all of God's creation. And biblically speaking, it's most obvious in perhaps the nature psalms where and the places where there's a sense that all creation is worshipping, all creation praises the living God. So we have in here a kind of a holistic interconnection where God and the people and the land just interrelate in multiple ways. And then the New Testament, coming to Colossians here, a reminder that all in heaven and earth is held in God, all things held together in God, and that all things were reconciled through the work of Jesus and through the blood of the cross. So what God has achieved through Jesus is not just for humanity, it is for everything and for all that God has made. Right, but I'm moving on now. That's something of the why, now something of the what of Forest Church. So I've put up my Grove booklet, a little bit of a plug, so I kind of apologise, but also I don't, because a Grove booklet is quite cheap and quite short, and always a really good introduction to a subject. So so handy to know that that's out there. So it's rooted in 5 visits to, visit to 5 forest churches, all of which could be reached within an hour of where I live here in Gloucester. And it illustrates the variety. So in my 5 forest churches, not including my own, one of them focuses very much on children and families. One of them is working primarily with children and families. One is intergenerational, with some children and families, but also a fair few adults who are attending without parental responsibilities, just kind of on their own or as couples. One which is working primarily with spiritual seekers and the kind of New Age and pagan community. That's not for everyone. If it's not your calling, just ignore that and let it pass you by. If it is your calling, please do it. But don't be alarmed if it's not your thing. That's absolutely fine. West Midlands tends to draw on forgotten British traditions. So honey cakes and Bridget crosses and candle making, I attended at Candlemas, and they burnt a branch of the Christmas tree. There's that sense of the connection at Candlemas between Christmas and Easter. So you're burning the Christmas tree and then looking forward to the story continuing as we look to the passion, death and resurrection of Jesus. So the other one was mostly adults in the final one. And then Bruce's, which I should give a mention, but isn't one of the ones I visited for the sake of this particular piece of research. Bruce tends to involve foraging and cooking in an awful lot of what he does. He knows his stuff on what we can eat that's out there in the wild, and so foraging and cooking happens quite a lot. One of the things I'm kind of wanting to illustrate in going through these 5 is just that Forest Church has a huge variety to it. There is one baseline, which is that you're doing outdoors what you couldn't do indoors. But other than that, as long as you're engaging with nature in one way or another, you do whatever makes sense in your own place and in your own community. So one group went for a walk. One did prayer stations based around the nature in a particular place. One did all kinds of activities, such as the candle making and the Bridget crosses that I referred to, and then with worship at the end. One stayed very close to a church in a church garden that is registered with the Quiet Gardens Trust. One went for a short walk and made that their base. It's a range again between formality and informality. One often worships in quite a formal way with a liturgy and quite a set routine and pattern with service sheets. Others are very much more informal and flexible and chaotic. My own is a little of the in-between. We do tend to have a service sheet, but we will start off on the service sheet and then we'll go free-form and a bit chaotic, and then we'll gather ourselves back again towards the end. You also don't need a forest. Forest Church is just a shorthand for outdoors. So if your local area has moorland or beach or grassland or a churchyard or anything else that you might think of, that is absolutely fine. So don't feel that if you don't have a forest that you can use, it can't be Forest Church, although it does go by all kinds of different names, and Muddy Church, Welly Church, Wild Church, and various things that don't even include the word church, but are kind of doing the same thing. So all of these things are pretty flexible, just as long as we stick to that one baseline, which is that we're doing outdoors what we couldn't do indoors, and we're engaging with nature in our worship. So coming towards the end, I'm going to hand over to Rachel shortly, but just going to talk briefly about preparation and content. So I prepare by going to the space where we're going to meet, looking at what's happening in nature, and kind of prayer walking really, seeking a connection between what I'm seeing going on in the natural world and a theme or a reading or something like that. So then I'll go quite shortly, maybe a week or so before we're due together, so that nature won't have changed too much between my visit and our gathering. But I've got a bit of time to then go back and prepare something around what I've found. And I'm going to go through a few examples of the kinds of themes that I might find myself working with. And I've got some autumn to Christmas ones for no particular reason, except that I had a few slides already ready, so that made life easy for me. So, I didn't talk about my my blackcurrants, did I? That was an autumn gathering, and we kind of had a cream tea, except we just squished blackberries on top of scones and clotted cream. So that's just a nice reminder of where food comes from, which is a basic nature connection that we forget because we get so used to our supermarkets. So, autumn going into winter. Everything's starting to look like it's dying or dead. There's the sense of dying back. but this sense that we know that spring is coming. We have an absolute certainty that spring is coming. So we watch the dying back. We look at the trees looking dead, and we know that that's not how it's going to stay. And so for me, it's just such a powerful reminder of Christian hope, and the sense that we hope in things that are unseen. We trust that springtime will come. Just as it does in nature. Falling leaves, letting go. What do we need to let go of? Evergreen and deciduous. Are we drawing back right now, or do we have some energy still to be in leaf, to be fruitful for those creatures that need the berries? A season of rest and recovery. Can we rest and recover? A season of waiting and trusting. Harvest for Wildlife. This is a particular gathering where we went looking to see, to kind of celebrate a harvest festival with the whole of nature, and to look at the berries and the nuts, and this verse from Matthew 6 we used as part of our gathering on that occasion. So it's not just humanity that God provides for, it is the whole of creation. So Harvest Festival can be so much bigger than what we tend to do in our churches. The kind of resources that I use, we use spotter sheets of this kind fairly frequently, and this one's from Wildlife Watch. Participating with God in new creation, this bulb planting. So rather than just watching what's happening, we get stuck in as well, and we get involved with what God is doing, which is so much the missional pattern, where God is at work and we join in. So bulb planting illustrates that beautifully. Dying back and regrowth, death and resurrection, the way in which nature illustrates the most profound truths of our faith on an annual basis. So this image is a dead leaf on a twig, but you can see the new growth which will become next year's leaves already there on the twig, and it sits there all winter with the buds waiting dormant and just ready to bring through their new life when the time is ready. And light in the darkness. It's sunset walk to a top of a hill, and on that occasion there was a beautiful sunset. We've sung Christmas carols from the top of this hill, kind of overlooking the city, making lanterns. I've got a couple of Bible verses up there with light in darkness theme woven in there. Little health warning for those of you doing Forest Church: we have also been up this hill looking for the sunset, and we found ourselves shrouded in mist and fog, and we couldn't see a thing. But then that's profound too, isn't it? Because we know that it's still happening. We know that despite the fog, despite not being able to see a thing, you know, the sunset is still happening, and God is still there, and God is still at work. But sometimes it's harder to see than other times, and it can still be quite fun playing around with torches in the mist and the fog. Final slide, and I'm going to hand over to Rachel. So this is from one of the interviews that I did with Forest Church facilitators, and she was talking about how if the outdoors is a spiritual place for so many people, then to explicitly notice that, to explicitly gather and pray in the way that a Forest Church does, it actually changes us. And then we find that when we go for a walk, and we're not particularly going out to worship or pray, we're just going for a walk, we can find ourselves worshiping God as we do, as we go, and how powerful it is that then becomes part of who we are and how we live. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share and hand over to Rachel.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about what the how might look like if I can make my screen share work. So let's see if I'm able. See if it's going to fancy playing from the beginning. It is. Look at that, effortlessly in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of who I am and what I do. And then I'm going to talk about some of my main themes about kind of what my day job is and what my Forest Church looks like. And talked about stuff to do with play and what that looks like, not just for children, but play for everybody. And then I'll talk a bit about the barriers that might be in the way to taking worship outdoors. So my day job is that I'm a forest school practitioner, which means that I'm really lucky. I get to spend my days being paid to make mud pies and make dens and toast marshmallows and all manner of nice stuff like that. And I'm also, I run Forest Church locally here in Walthamstow. We're kind of playing around. It's the Forest, Epping Forest, but Epping Forest, Forest Church, it's got too many forests in it, hasn't it? So we're kind of playing around with the name. The old name for Walthamstow is Wilcombe, which means place of welcome, which is actually quite a nice thing to kind of couch it in. So that's what we've run with. And my Forest Church practice is very much coming out of my Forest School practice. And for those of you who don't know, a quick dummies guide to Forest School, it's a way of allowing children to explore and learn in the outdoors. So it's really shaped by the seasons, shaped by nature, and is also really participant driven. So rather than me coming with an agenda of stuff that I'm wanting them to learn to get out of the session, I come up with some ideas and I might say, here's something we might do, here's something we might do, kind of invitations to play. And sometimes if invitations will stick. You're right there, Catherine.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you in your flow. A few people have put in the chat they're finding it a little bit hard to hear you. Can you be a little bit closer or a little bit louder?
I can come closer and I can also shout a bit louder. That would be fine.
No
worries. So rather than me kind of saying, here's the things we're going to learn today, it's kind of invitations to play. And sometimes they'll get stuck into the stuff that I've thought of, but quite often whatever they're wanting to do kind of drives their play, their exploration, their learning themselves. And my job as a facilitator is to try to not put myself in the way all the time, but to kind of hold the space so that they've got a safe place to explore and to learn. And I think that that's quite similar with how I run Forest Church, because obviously, as Kate was saying, when you were talking about how you plan, Kate, I thought that sounds really familiar. So I'll be walking the space and thinking about kind of how it interplays with maybe the church calendar and what's happening in the church at the time, and looking at nature and kind of seeing how nature and my faith are talking with each other. But I'm not wanting to come in a way to tell people, this is what nature has told me and now you need to learn it the same. I'm wanting people to be able to launch into their own explorations. So I might similarly have kind of invitations to play, to pray, to worship that people might take part in, and I will always follow it up with, but you might have a good idea of your own. And sometimes it can be really interesting to see where that leads, because particularly if you're working with a bunch of different ages or people of a bunch of different experiences in the church, it's very tempting to always be saying, we will now tell you how your faith journey is going to go and what you're going to find out next about Jesus, about what the God who made you and loves you, we're going to tell you the next step in your faith journey. And when you open it up and take the lid off, and at the end people are talking to each other about what it is that they've heard from God, what they've discovered, what God's shown them through the world around them, even tiny little children can come up with something completely new and fresh that's really valuable for adults to listen to, or maybe people who aren't used to talking in particularly church language can come up with something quite profound that opens up things for other people. So it makes it much more level playing field, and kind of I like to think of it, it's kind of like church with the roof taken off, and literally it is, isn't it? You kind of take that lid off and allow people to think kind of outside the box of a building, because there you are literally outside the box for building. You don't have a roof over your head, so in a way you don't have a roof over what people are allowed to wonder. So one of the things I tend to rant on about quite a lot is about play, because with Forest School, it's learning through play. Forest School, where it started in Denmark, and I've been to visit, it's very much 3 to 6 year olds. It's younger children who are exploring through play, and then they go into a school, and it's much more like you would expect learning to look like after they get to the age of 7. Forest School in the UK has grown and morphed into a kind of different creature, really. And so I work with all ages. I have groups which have got babies and parents. So in a way, I'm working with the babies, but more I'm facilitating the nature connection for their parents. I've got toddlers, I've got children of school age, I work with schools and nurseries, I've got teenagers, I've done sessions for adults. And I think that play is something that's really important for everybody. And I think that being outside is somewhere where people naturally find that space to play. It's quite interesting when I'm doing Forest School training, we talk about the sense of this kind of state of flow state that children get into when they're in deep play. And that's what it's called when, you know, when you have a child and they're busy playing and you can't drag them away from it. They kind of don't even hear you if you call them to come and have drink and a snack, because they're so engrossed in what they're doing. And that's when the deep learning is happening. And I think what I find quite interesting is that that feels very much to me like prayer, really. That sense of being so deeply engrossed in something that it kind of envelops you. And so I think that kind of state of deep play is very much like a state of deep prayer, really. And actually it is when we're in that kind of deep sense of prayer that we start to discover things as well, isn't it? I think that's when kind of learning gets switched on. So just because you have adults in a group doesn't mean that you can't play. I think sometimes we can be tempted when we're working, particularly with groups with children and with adults, we'll say, well, here are the activities for the children, and then here's the stuff that the adults can do. So I purposefully try to make sure that everything is offered to everyone, because sometimes you'll find a child who wants to go and sit under a tree and just sit and watch the clouds go by. Sometimes you'll have an adult who's desperately wanting to play, but kind of play with a purpose. So we've got this lady here who came to one of my adult sessions. She's whittled her own knife, she's made a toasting fork, she's toasted her own fruit bread, and that kind of sense of kind of achievement and well-being that you can get from doing something that has a purpose, I think can be really valuable. And inside a Forest church setting, having a reason for doing the activities, if you've got activities, a reason for playing and praying and worshipping, I think can be settling, not just for people who may be coming in from outside who don't know quite what to expect. Sometimes it can feel comforting to know there's a reason to do something, but also kind of the feedback for yourself. If there was a purpose for it, then you kind of get a whole bunch of other good stuff coming in. So it's for adults as well. Also, the other side of the spectrum, there's kind of purposeless play that I think children can be really good at teaching us. Sometimes when I have sessions with toddlers and their parents will apologise to me at the end that their child has been seemingly kind of not in, like, I've got lots of different activities for people to do, and maybe their child spent all the time pouring mud from one bucket to another, or all the time snipping with a pair of secateurs, little bits of stick, not to make anything, but just for the activity itself. I think this kind of purposeless play, it's really important as well, not just because you get this kind of sense of delight and joy in yourself. And if you're an adult, sometimes adults do purposeless play. I think sometimes we pretend that we don't, but sometimes people will kind of fold their tea towels and put them beautifully in a cupboard, won't they? You don't need to fold your tea towels and put them beautifully, but kind of there's a sense of order and beauty to do with something that doesn't have to be done. So not just for us, but I think also it teaches us something quite profound about how it isn't what we do that is of delight to God, but God just delights in us being ourselves, in our own usness, and that kind of thing that we can be taught through just playing without a reason for playing, without an end result, I think can be something that feeds into a sense of kind of being loved as who we are. Playing can be quite a sacred space, particularly when I'm thinking about that kind of zone of kind of playing when you're in that flow state. Had really wonderful times with groups of young people, if you're sitting around a fire and maybe whittling together, and conversations that bubble up, but also quietness that bubbles up as well. If quietness is something that's unfamiliar, having a fiddly activity to do is sometimes a kind of safe way in to unpacking that kind of depth of silence without it feeling like a threat. And of course, if we're outside rather than stuck inside a building, silence is never completely silent, is it? If you're still, maybe is a better word to use, because the trees are moving around you, and you've got the bird song, and you've got the hoverfly that buzzes past your ear, and you've got the kind of clouds of dust when somebody's moved their feet that you watch moving. You see the caterpillars coming down from the trees, floating about. There's stuff moving all around you. There's sounds, and that kind of silence that surrounds you is sort of a different quality. In a way, it's very stilling to be surrounded by a fidgeting world. I find it anyway, if I'm fidget myself, but if I'm outside of nature's fidgeting for me, then I'm able to be still in a way that I can't be otherwise. Play is something that's really important for everybody of every age. Like I was saying, don't just say, here's the activities for the children and now adults, you can do this. It's a very human activity. If you kind of look in kind of archaeological record, you find playthings all the way back through time. If you watch any adults kind of sitting around in a group, you notice people playing, people fiddling. Here I am fiddling with my ring, fiddling it round and round. People kind of are naturally drawn to explore through playing. So it seems an obvious way for people to be able to open up things of faith as well, particularly if they're not necessarily from a church background. So if the church bit's already unfamiliar, then to couch it in something that feels more instinctive allows you to access it better. So barriers towards taking these wonderful things of worship outdoors and enjoying what it's got to offer us outside. There's lots of reasons that people will say, oh, well, we couldn't do that. And I expect those of you listening are already thinking what people in the PCC, you know, the person in the PCC who's going to say, well, we can't do that because there's always a good reason. And for some people, things being outside, it's not comfortable, it's not familiar anyway. So here I've got my lovely handful of worms to give everybody a shudder. I've always been quite fond of worms. I've trained myself to fall in love with slugs over the past few years because, yeah, I have a lot of time I spend with slugs at the moment, and I didn't used to like them, and I like them much better now. I think that kind of sitting and being with them and watching them, that noticing, isn't it? You notice how it feels, you notice how it sparkles in the sunlight, you notice how it slides, you notice how the little hole opens and closes as it breathes, and as you notice, you stop feeling revolted and you start to feel that sense of wonder, that connection that Kate was talking about. Anyway, that's by the by. We don't have to talk about the worms. So one reason people will say this won't work is because of weather. And here in the UK, we are blessed with lots of wondrous weather. People love to talk about the weather because it's never the same from day to day and it's quite unpredictable. I've just been on holiday to the Isles of Scilly, where you're trying to check what the weather's going to be, but they can never seem to forecast because tiny rocks in the middle of the Atlantic, and it never quite works. So I really like this quote here about weather, which goes a bit deeper than just kind of, will it be rainy or will it be sunny? Good idea to play out in the rain. I know you all know the quote, no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. But I quite like this, it goes a bit further. Encouraging a child to go outside in all weathers builds resilience, but more importantly, it saves them from spending their life merely tolerating the bad days in favour of a handful of good ones. A life of endless expectations and conditions where happiness hinges on sunshine. And don't we all have that so much? The weather, it's sunny and everyone goes out, and the weather changes and everyone goes, oh, it's bad weather day. So we kind of put different value on different weathers, don't we? And I think that can kind of creep over into other bits of your life. You value something, kind of these things are good and these things are bad, but actually they're all just things. I think if you can get used to weather as being just the weather, just the thing, whichever one it is, and I think that helps all over the place. So realistically, how do we make it be that we can enjoy all the weathers, whatever it is? Well, first, as I said, so it's about clothing, which obviously is going to change depending on the community that you're part of. Some people will be well set up, having like the right kit, and if you say we'll meet up, and then they'll look out the window and it's raining, everybody's going to have the right clothes. Some places you might not. I've had some success in getting waterproof clothing from like funding for it from estate agents local to here, because I think they have guilt about ramping up house prices with gentrification. So they have money pots set aside, so people have managed to get funding to buy a waterproof kit for that. And also things like putting up, if you have a tarp, so you can put up a shelter so people can keep in a dry bit if they want to. But more than that, more than just equipping yourself to be out in whatever the weather throws at you, is kind of turning it around on its head and valuing the weather for being what it is. Like Kate was saying, when she's out then kind of looking at the season and that kind of relationship between what's happening outside seasonality and the scriptures or a church calendar. Actually, there's quite a lot of overlap with weather as well, isn't it? If you think about so much of the scriptures that you're reading, there's often an awful lot of weather that's going on, isn't there? There's lots of wind in the Bible, there's lots of rain in the Bible, there's lots of storms, and actually experiencing them firsthand and while reading about them is something quite exciting. So, for example, like if you're talking about I don't know, God's abundant blessings raining down upon us, and you're inside the rain, then how much more do you understand it at a far deeper level? Or maybe if you're thinking about God being our shelter and you're actually having to make a shelter to keep yourself dry, you have such a stronger sense of what it means to be protected inside a shelter as you're hiding inside it with the rain thundering around you. It kind of, the weather can be really useful in speaking to us of those things of God, and so it's worth embracing that and running with it. Another reason that people will worry about having things outside, and this is a fairly big one, is this idea about risk. People worry that if you're inside, you can control it, can't you? It's much easier to control. You make sure that the floor's nice and flat, you make sure that the kettle's in a room with the door shut, and then you know that people aren't going to be injuring themselves and everything can proceed as normal. One of the first things I do when I get a new group outside is we talk through my kind of 3 rules, and my first one is always unpacking about looking after yourself and what that looks like when you're outside. I remind people that the ground's not flat. Sounds silly, but it's important to notice, isn't it? And that kind of putting your head in the right position, noticing that the ground does have lumps and bumps, that there are bits that you might trip up on. All of that I think is really valuable and really important, because then you're able to use it as soon as you notice what to look out for. Nice quote here: I believe the biggest risk our children face today is never being exposed to risk. It's really important to know how to manage yourself around risk. And lots of stuff we do in life is risky. Every time you get in your car to drive, you're having to manage risks. Every time at the moment, every time you go to the supermarket, you're balancing the risk of being around lots of other people against not having food in your house. You know, we're balancing risk all the time. It's important to learn how to do it. And being outdoors is a natural way for that to happen. But more so, particularly when you're talking about things of faith. Faith is quite a risky business, isn't it? Jesus never said, follow me and everything's going to be easy. It's not, is it? We know that's true. It's not that everything will be easy. It will be that Jesus will be with us, and Jesus is there holding our hand through these risks and through these dangerous times. And to kind of unpack the riskiness of faith in a risky environment feels to me to have something really quite important to tell us and to kind of show us about that. So I've written here why risk assessments are your new best friend. When I'm teaching forest school trainees about risk assessments. That's a bit everybody groans, because nobody likes writing risk assessments, because in a way it feels like you're putting a damper on all the good stuff that might be about to happen. But I teach it, so we have a column for what the risk is, we have a column for what the action is that you're going to put in place to make things be not dangerous. That's a difference, isn't it? So if you've got a hazard, we don't want the hazard, but if you kind of worked it out as a risk, you can sort out your action and manage the risk. I also have a third column at the end which says risk benefits, and that I think is something that can be quite interesting and worth embracing. So, for example, if we had a Forest Church session and our risk was that we had muddy, slippy ground on the paths. So our risk is that people might slip on the mud, that they might fall and hurt themselves. We might worry that people might slip on the mud and twist their ankles or break their arms, whatever it is we're worried about. So the action we might put in place might be that we have a rope to hold along the worst of the muddy patch, or that we go a kind of move the path so it goes a different way. But if we have our risk benefits, our risks of walking along this muddy path is maybe it might lead us to think about what it's like walking along in mud, what it's like to help somebody not slip in the mud, thinking about that bit in the sun where you pull me out of the miry pit. You know, how do you understand a miry pit unless you've been trapped in one and had your friend pulling you out of the miry pit to safety? And I think that if you do a risk benefit assessment well, in a way it's going to half plan your Forest Church session for you. If you're thinking about what's this risk got to tell me about the things of God, how will God speak to me through these things that we've got out here that are less than perfect, then you're going to be able to find lots of really good things that you can share with the people who are coming along to worship with you. I think that was my last slide. It was. So I will stop share there.
Thank you so much for that. I've written so many notes. That was just the most fascinating 50 minutes, and your enthusiasm is infectious. There's quite a few questions, and I'm conscious we probably don't have quite enough time. If you two are willing to, I might keep you till about 5:05, if that's all right, if you don't need to be straight away, because I can see that the questions look very interesting. I'm going to go to the second question first. It says, is there a database of forest churches around the country? So can people find a list somewhere?
I think the nearest we've got to a list is on the Facebook group. So there is a Forest Church Facebook group, which I just looked it up actually while Rachel was talking. 2.2k members at the moment, and there's a sticky post at the top where people are invited to say if they've got a group. So I think that is the nearest we've got to a definitive list.
Okay. The first one is actually a suggestion, which I think is a really good suggestion, which says, please will you design a good poster? I think this is addressed to me rather than you. Design a good poster for Churches Count on Nature to explain to grave visitors why their churchyard looks as if the church doesn't care. I think that's a really good suggestion. Consider it noted. I have written it in my book. That doesn't mean it'll happen tomorrow, but it's written in my book. The next question says, Rachel, do you offer a series of sessions or a variety of one-off events during the year? I also wondered if you have the sessions as drop-ins or booked events, and if you set a maximum number like you might with forest school activities.
So I do one-off events through the year. I generally kind of, I don't know, around I try and do around 8, kind of vaguely following kind of Celtic Wheel of the Year, kind of that seasonality stuff. And sometimes I have people who come to all of them. Some people kind of come to some and not to others. I don't have them as booked with maximum numbers because I've never found that as an issue. I've never been massively booked out. I think if I notice that being a problem, then yes, if you know, Jenny, that you're going to end up with hundreds of people, you would have to run quite a different session, wouldn't you? It would have a very different feeling. So yeah, I think it probably depends, like you're saying, depends what the session looks like. And I think probably if it was something that was more formalised, then maybe you can absorb more people into it. And if it's more kind of play workshopy based, then you're going to have to be a bit more tight on numbers.
But presumably, Rachel, in those kind of in Forest Church sessions, the children are the responsibility of their parents.
Yes.
So you don't have ratios that you need to have.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have parents with them, and obviously at the moment, then you've got a number limit on people anyway. So we're up to, is it 30 for outsides at the moment? So so you would have to limit it if you thought it was going to be more.
The next question says, do you use godly play with Forest Church?
I don't personally. There is actually a post this morning, I think, or last night, about godly play on the Facebook group. So somebody obviously is, but I don't personally. But I think there's space for creativity in all kinds of ways. I think my only hesitation would be just make sure that we are engaging with nature rather than kind of bringing in resources from outside in order to tell the story. So I think I might want to wonder in true godly play style how we might tell the story with what is around us in the natural world.
We've used sometimes, like for example, we've done like the Christmas story, go and make yourself a Christmas, like a nativity set out of what you can find and use that to tell stories. So there is kind of, you can use whatever it is to manipulate, can't you?
Absolutely. We've done similar. We've also kind of made ourselves stables out of twigs and stuff and that sort of thing.
Certainly plenty of eye wandering, I think. I think the language crosses over fairly well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. The next question is from Kate, who says, do you find being outdoors, you draw on the words of Christ all the more as he drew on nature to teach?
Well, I do have a new understanding of how connected with the natural world Jesus must have been. So many of his stories are nature based, and the parables and the seed that dies in order to live, and growth and harvest, and it's just kind of all over there in the Gospels. Yes, I draw on that, I guess is the short answer, and I notice that resonance between what I'm seeing outdoors and what I read in the stories in a new and different way.
Yes, and it's not like there weren't urban sites when Jesus was walking around. There weren't they? And it's interesting that he goes back again and again to those things of nature.
Yeah.
Then Mark has a question that bushcraft and woodcraft has been a growing subculture in the UK, and I wonder if there's a natural crossover here, particularly among young men who are turning away from our normal church. I think that's a really interesting, but I maybe would broaden that question out a little bit more, that it's really clear from your pictures and examples that you're reaching some young people who I'm picturing wouldn't go to church, and it would just be interesting for your reflections on that for young men in the question, but also more broadly about engaging with young people in this way.
So my daughter actually goes to a youth group in a local church, which meets outdoors and does an awful lot of bushcraft, which they don't actually carry the Forest Church label as such. They're just a youth group with they just decided to do it that way, and then the pandemic hit about 6 months later, so then they were able to carry on, which was fabulous. Is there a crossover? I think it's just this whole movement of getting outdoors, which is huge in society at the moment, and rediscovering the outdoors and traditional crafts that we've lost and forgotten, and the joy of whittling, and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not sure I'm quite answering the question, but yes, I want to celebrate that, and absolutely it engages with people who we might not find coming to our Sunday morning church services. Rachel, do you want to add anything?
Not particularly. I mean, I'm writing a confirmation book at the confirmation course at the moment, which isn't exactly for young men, but it's definitely a confirmation course that's in kind of the bushcraft kind of setting. So thinking about that kind of interplay between faith being a risky endeavour and risky activities, I suppose, which is maybe kind of where you're coming from, Mark.
Yeah, it's we don't perhaps talk enough about risk in our churches, do we? Yeah, arguably with huge amount of gender stereotyping, that's perhaps something that young men need particularly to hear and to understand and to explore. I realise there's a huge baggage of gender stereotyping there, which is not entirely helpful, but perhaps we'll just go there for the moment.
Oh, I bet this next question will ring true with many people, given what you said, Rachel, on your slides. How have you managed the issue of a very risk-averse PCC who are anxious about any outdoor event?
I think it's just really helpful to show that you know what you're talking about as far as risk goes, that you're not just winging it. I think as soon as you start talking in terms of what you're putting in place, the things that you've noticed, the kind of risks that you've identified, then people do start to realise you're taking it seriously and they do trust it a bit more. I think people's fear is that you're going to go, hey, let's all just go and do it without thinking. And of course, they're going to worry about that.
Do you sort of take it in steps from taking indoor worship outdoors first and then taking outdoor worship more to forest church? Is that a way to approach it if there's a PCC who sees it as sort of too different and too much in one go?
I haven't been on that journey. I've just jumped straight to outdoors and nature connection and all of that. I can see that in, you have to work with the people that you're working with, don't you? You start with where you are, and if that is a necessary intermediate step for the people that you're working with, then by all means do what you need to do, and you can kind of gently kind of go down that process. Yeah,
having things that feel familiar in the interim is always useful, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's lots of forest churches that actually use their churchyards. They gather in their churchyard, and that perhaps feels safer than going properly into the wild for a lot of people, because that's a familiar space, isn't it?
Oh, there's a very sensible follow-up question that says, can you explain godly play? Because there was the previous question asking whether you used it. Obviously, some people are going, what's godly play?
I'm no expert, but it's a way of telling the stories of our faith in a way that invites people to participate and to wonder and to explore with their imagination, and just engage with the stories kind of wholeheartedly, rather than just hearing them being told from the outside, as it were.
The next is just a comment from Anne, I think, on the previous thing about signage, and I've seen this sign as well. It says, "Pardon the weeds, we're feeding the bees," which I do think is nice. I think, given the time, I'll make the next question the last one, which is from Jenny. Have you found you have more people attending who are not churchgoers, and has it encouraged any of them to then come to the wider church services? I'm wondering how to advertise it to engage with the wider community, as I think if it appears too churchy, it might put some of our community off. Any reflections on that?
Okay, I think the baseline for all pioneer ministry and fresh expressions is relationships and networks. So if you to put up a poster and expect people to come cold, they probably won't. But if you have built relationships with people that you can then invite to a thing because they trust you and they know you, then there's a good chance that people will come. So I think just go with relationships first, and all will be well.
Yeah, I think kind of it links in with that question from Hannah's below as well. The people who come who aren't churchgoers, I do have people who come who feel, either people who kind of feel some sense of spirituality, who are wanting to come to something but quite vehemently don't want to come to a church, or people who want their children to experience something of spirituality even though they don't have a faith themselves. So atheists who are saying, if I want my child to be free to make a choice when they're older, I have to show them what a faith community looks like. So I do have some people involved who are from that kind of background as well. So I wouldn't be thinking it's going to encourage them to come to wider church services. For them, it's fine for this to be what they do. And yeah, so there are people who wouldn't come if it was in a church. They come because of what it is.
Lovely, thank you so much. Before I bring us to a close, I just wondered if you had any sort of, if people have joined and they're feeling inspired, what should they do first? What should they do tomorrow that would help them towards this model of church?
They need to go outside and find a space, and then they can see 5 things that they can see, and 4 things that they can hear, and 3 things that they can touch, and 2 things that they can smell, and 1 thing they can taste.
So finding that connection for themselves before they start trying to spread it to anyone else.
It's interesting. I was going to say exactly the same thing. I wasn't going to do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, but I was going to say you start with yourself. You start with learning to engage with God in nature yourself, and as it becomes real for yourself, then the possibility of being able to share that with others is grown, and then it goes from there.
Well, lovely. Thank you so much. It's been such an inspirational hour. It's absolutely lovely hearing you talk about this, and I'm sure you will have inspired other people around the country to do the same. And thank you both, Rachel and Kate, so much for volunteering your time to do this webinar today. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today to hear. After we finish now, I'll send you round the slides, the links from the chat and the feedback form. And I really hope that you come along to some of the other webinars this week.
Fabulous. Thanks, Catherine.
Bye, everyone.